Criminals rule our cities. True political clout throughout most of the world rests in the hands of drug lords and organized crime leaders. In our cities, drive-by shootings and drug-related murders have pushed homicide figures to all-time highs. The federal deficit in the United States and Canada is increasing at the rate of more than $1 billion a day. World leaders are cooperating as never before in an attempt to stem the rising tide of crime before society breaks down entirely. It's a losing battle. The more the economy slides, the worse crime gets. The more crime increases, the more money is lost fighting it. There seems to be only one real answer. The world has no choice but to eliminate the profit motive associated with crime. The big question is how. The most popular idea is through the elimination of cash. Cash is anonymous and untraceable. The drug trade would collapse if it couldn't operate in the shadows. Underground economies that survive by avoiding taxes would not be able to exist without cash. The untaxed revenues from such activity could easily balance the budget without raising the burden on the honest citizen. And the money now spent on fighting crime would flow back into the treasury. There is still a problem. A criminal could still access your bank account simply by obtaining your card and your personal identification number, especially since the elimination of cash would make single transaction limits cumbersome. There is a new technology which can address this problem. Humane societies are now using something called InfoPet as a pet tracing device. By injecting this tiny microchip under the skin, all the information necessary to return a lost pet can be recorded electronically. Using this same technology, a criminal would be unable to steal the access codes. By implanting the chip under the skin, say on the hand or the head, criminal activity for gain would be all but eliminated. The budget would be balanced in a year or two, and the criminal element is virtually bankrupted by this wonderful new technology. The Bible predicted exactly such a system would be necessary and would be put into effect in the last days. According to Revelation 13:16, the Antichrist will causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name.
This, Paul, is really one of the most incredible prophecies in the entire Word of God. And the reason is simple. Here is a scripture that lays out exactly how the system will work in the last days, that no man will be able to buy or sell unless they have a mark in their right hand or in their forehead. There's not a lot of room for questioning what is really meant there, any symbolism to figure out. It is a statement of fact. You could never keep track of the buying and selling of everyone on the planet Earth before the age of technology that we have today. You know, technology is exploding. When I worked for a ministry a few years ago, this would be 10 years ago now, they had a computer that virtually the size of this room to keep track of 100,000 subscribers. I now have a computer that I just do a little bit of writing on that could do all that that could do. Technology is exploding. Personal computers, electronic banking, automated teller machines, satellites that can move millions of dollars of cash around in the world, and now a system where you can keep track of your pet, you know, your cat or your dog for $35. You go into the Humane Society and they will inject a microchip under that cat's skin. Now, wherever you live in the United States, if your cat runs away and comes to Niagara Falls here, I can take him into the Humane Society. They run a scanner, just like the ones in the grocery stores, over the back of this cat, and boom, up on a database that spreads North America that can keep track of 4 billion cats and dogs comes your name and address so that, you know, we can Federal Express your cat back to you. This technology exists in this generation, and it's never existed before. This is one of the clearest fulfillments of Bible prophecy anywhere in the Bible.
You know, what's equally fascinating to the new technology are the reasons in our generation now that are being brought forth to justify this technology.
Sure.
I mean, it's not just a question of lost cats. They're talking about using it on lost children, for example.
That's right.
It would eliminate kidnapping or child napping.
You know, there's a fella, Dr. Daniel Mann, who we interviewed in our video, The Mark of the Beast, and he has a patent for a microchip to put under the skin, a transponder, and he is an Israeli. He wants to suggest that all Israeli army members and government members have this chip implanted, so if they're kidnapped by terrorists, immediately they turn on a satellite in the sky, picks up the signal, and they know exactly where it is. The reasons for bringing this technology forth are very compelling, from the lost children, to the diplomats we're talking about, to the more senior citizens, older folks who, with Alzheimer's disease and so on, wander on a little bit.
Sure, and with the elimination of borders that they're talking about now in the new United Europe, it allows them to track the movement of people between countries without always having to have the border guards and all that kind of nonsense.
You know, if you travel now through JFK Airport in New York City, you can avoid the long lineups for immigration if you're willing to put your hand in a scanner that identifies who you are. Just an electronic way of speeding up the passage of people in this new world order. In Spain, I don't want to go too long, but there was a conference in Spain about a year and a half ago now, where they said, hey, we live in an open world now. How are we going to keep track of people as they go from one nation to the other? Make sure they're paying taxes in the right area and make sure that they're where they're supposed to be. And they said microchip technology is the only way to do it. So exactly what the Bible said 2,000 years ago is coming to pass for the first time in this generation.
In Matthew 24, we read that in the last days there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Well, there have always been famines and earthquakes and pestilences, but Jesus said that they would be like birth pangs, which means that they'll become more intense and closer together as we approach the end of the age. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the world has experienced increasingly violent and frequent killer quakes. With each passing decade, the number of earthquakes worldwide has been on the increase. For example, between 1900 and 1910, only one quake registering over 6 on the Richter scale was reported. That was the famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In the following 2 decades, there were 4, then 5 in the 40s, 13 in the 60s, 56 in the 70s, and between 1980 and 1989, 74 quakes occurred which involved substantial loss of life. Moreover, the earthquakes are occurring in places not normally prone to such seismic disturbances on an ever-increasing scale. Turning to Somalia, the world is watching in horror as television records an entire nation slowly starving to death. Africa is experiencing a famine which threatens the entire continent. There is only enough fresh water to supply 1/3 of the continent's population. Food production has declined 20% in the past 20 years, while the population has increased. Meanwhile, medical science is battling AIDS, the first epidemic disease in history to be 100% fatal and incurable. Tuberculosis and cholera are reappearing on the world scene, as is leprosy and other supposedly controlled diseases. New forms of venereal disease are being discovered, many of them resistant to known forms of therapy. Grant Jeffrey offers this insight.
Today, the famine situation, according to the World Health Organization, over 1 billion people are in malnutrition. 500 million have no clean water or sanitation. The worst problem of all is AIDS. The President of the United States received a report 10 months ago from the Central Intelligence Agency. That report, which was compiled from the World Health Organization reports, the Center for Disease Control, and African doctors, brought together all the information on AIDS. And what it said, Pete, was this. It said that up to 75% of the population of the sub-Sahara Africa, that part of Africa south of the Sahara, 75% would, in their estimate, be afflicted with the HIV virus, which inevitably causes AIDS in the next 6 to 8 years. What that report is telling the President of the United States is that the worst disaster of absolutely apocalyptic proportions is taking place for the first time in history. We are looking at the death of a good part of a continent. The Bible tells us that Asia and South America are also areas that will be afflicted, and that's what this Central Intelligence Agency report said as well. We are looking at the fulfillment of prophecies that have never, ever been able to be fulfilled in any other generation. This is the time, I believe, when Jesus Christ is going to come for his church.
You know, there has always been the question asked of students of Bible prophecy, you mean the only sign you have of the end times is earthquakes, famines, and pestilences? You know, we've always had those things. What makes this generation any different? But as we pointed out in this story, what we're talking about is an exponential increase in these things. People will say, you know, earthquakes, you're saying that they're increasing every decade, but people certainly, you know, in 1900 didn't have the equipment that we have today to track and keep track of earthquakes.
You don't need extremely sophisticated equipment to detect a 6.0 earthquake. When the building around you starts falling down, you don't need...
well, that's exactly right. In 1900, they may not have had the major equipment, but they weren't stupid either. They knew when there was a major quake. And so we're seeing an increase. And even if you leave earthquakes aside, let's look at the weather that we've been witnessing, this increase in extremely devastating weather. They have what are known as Category 5 100-year storms. This is the caliber of Andrew and Aniki that we've just seen.
And the 100-year name means that they're only expected to come once every 100 years or so.
That's right, and we have had 4 since 1988. So it's showing an incredible increase in these. You know, in Luke chapter 21, it talks about the waves and the seas roaring in the last days. Now that can have a double meaning, you know, about the people in turmoil, but it also is the weather exploding in this generation, unlike any other generation. So all of these things are coming to pass in greater frequency and intensity right now.
You know, one of the other points that we brought up is about pestilence. And a lot of times when you think about pestilence, you're thinking about things like the bubonic plague or cholera, which we mentioned is coming back. But the plagues of old that were carried around in great herds of rats spreading across Europe and bringing disease, really though, you have to talk about things like heart disease and cancer and of course AIDS.
As Grant was talking about, and that's the first time I'd ever heard of rats traveling in a herd, incidentally. But there is this realization that we have to make that the worst pestilence mankind has ever known is going to be the AIDS crisis. They're just, you know, you talk to doctors, we talk to Dr. John Cianci all the time, who is recognized by the U.S. government as an expert on AIDS, and he says with this long incubation period, we are only at the beginning of this disease now. It is going to mushroom. And of course, what Grant Jeffrey has been talking about, you could see sub-Sahara Africa virtually wiped out. This is a pestilence. It's interesting that it's a last days pestilence that is totally being spread by man's own activity. It's not something that you just catch, you know, coming through the air. This is something that your own activity brings forth. So once again, earthquakes, famines, and pestilence all increasing exponentially in this generation, exactly as the Bible said. If this was just by itself, it might not be a big thing, but it's another piece of the puzzle.
And you know, when you talk about the AIDS virus and how it's going to spread, a lot of people would say, well, they have so many people researching it, all it is a matter of them finding the cure, and then that one's wiped out. When we did talk to John Cianci, he told us that this is an extremely smart virus. Every time they manage to come up with something they think, here is something that can combat that virus, it instantly mutates and becomes a whole different virus. The drugs are ineffective, and they're just fighting a losing battle. And it seems every time they take a step forward, they take 10 steps back. So it really does have the potential of spreading worldwide very quickly.
That's right. They are already talking now about HIV too. They can't even quite detect exactly what this virus is, but the same symptoms. So they're up against something very serious, and as you say, could spread worldwide.